Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons, a philosophy podcast about big topics in bite-sized pieces. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education at Liberty University, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of philosophy and English at Genesee Community College. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about time. Along with cosmology and consciousness, I think time is one of the most interesting topics in philosophy. All three have a common denominator, namely, that they are so integral to the human experience they become mundane, and yet they persist as the greatest unknowable mysteries we've ever encountered. A discussion of time involves asking a diverse number of questions. Is it real? Does it have limitations? Can it be manipulated? We'll be tackling all of those and more in this episode, as well as engaging in what I know from previous experience to be a mind-bending conversation at the end of the show. So sit back, strap in, and prepare to travel into the future, 1 second at a time. All right, so time. We got kind of an interesting podcast here. Do you have anything you want to say about it before we jump in?
Well, only that I'm glad to hear that it's one of your favorite topics too, because it certainly is mine. And so it dovetails my fascination with science fiction, lifelong. Anything from endless time travel stories in Star Trek to the marvelous iterations of Doctor Who and all the way back to the very earliest time machine novel. Up until it's still, I have a book that I teach in a science fiction class with. The whole book was edited a couple of years ago, and it's just current time travel stories, all kinds of different flavors.
The history of science fiction is something that's always kind of interesting. I was looking that up in preparation for this. Like, what was the first time travel story? And there's some debate about it. There's the one where there's a clock that when you set it, it only runs backwards, and anybody close to it goes in reverse and stuff. And they say, well, that's not really time travel because it doesn't have like a mechanism for use or whatever. But I mean, think about it. You get close to a black hole and your time slows down because of the gravity well. And we don't really have, we know mathematically what the process of it is.
Even flying in a jet. If flying in a jet, your time is different than by micro measures, but measurable, different than if you're staying on the ground.
And that's why GPS works, is because if we didn't have Einstein's theory of relativity, then your GPS wouldn't work because it's in space, so it's traveling at the time differences doesn't match up.
Oh, we're going to have fun.
Well, a side note, if there's a flat Earth, that wouldn't be possible. If Einstein was wrong, that wouldn't be possible. So there's a few different things going on there. But so we'll jump into the first section, which is kind of the character of time. And this has been probably the bigger debate about the question of time in philosophy. And that is, is time a real thing, or is it something that we just kind of make up as part of, or even, as a necessary element of human experience? Do we just experience time because if we didn't experience time, we wouldn't be able to experience any sensory information at all? So what are the backgrounds historically of how that argument has gone?
Okay, well, we start with the pre-Socratics again, Parmenides, late, you want to say early. See, this is a time thing. When you're talking about BCE time frames, you're going from the 500s to 400s. So it's always fun. So Parmenides says time is either an illusion or it's infinite. And in either case, reality is timeless. And so he was one of the earliest monists, with the universe being made of all one thing. We just perceive it differently because we're not good enough to be able to be on the outside looking in. Then there's Heraclitus. You like the word cosmology and so on. He invented cosmos, the term. Go on to. Thought I would let you know that as a little side note. So time is transformation. Time marks the process. Time involves change. But again, Parmenides says time is illusory. It's an illusion. Reality is a single thing. And that comes back many hundreds of years later. There's a thing of early, again, we're still in the BCE time frame. Two words that you'll recognize. One is chronos. And not just referencing the old Greek gods, but chronos it becomes in philosophy measured time, refers to measured time. And then there's kairos, K-A-I-R-O-S. And kairos is experienced time. So it's qualitative time, often measured on decisive moments.
That's sort of an interesting thing because like before they even had, scientific measurements, seconds, minutes, hours, that sort of thing, they already knew there was a distinction between measurable time and how you experience time. And that's kind of we sort of take that for granted because, when you have a clock, it's easy to say, oh, it's only been an hour, or, oh my gosh, it's been an hour, that sort of thing. But if you don't have a clock, it's sort of weird to think that you'd have that same sensation.
It is. Some of the best days, we're all kinds of side notes. It's time. Some of the best days are those when one isn't looking at the clock, just pursuing what you pursue. If I'm doing a piece of artwork or I'm working on something for class, sitting in front of a fire, reading a novel, and you get the sense that the light is different coming through the windows and so on, but you have it experienced. You might have experienced years in a novel and you've experienced nothing about the hours that have passed by you until you emerge. The first time travel story is the first human memory.
Mm. Yeah, and that's something that we'll get into a little bit later, is how humans kind of experience and store time as part of that. But so what are the two camps as far as people who think of time as being real and people who think of time as being a construct? What are the two camps? And
currently, you said the first one, Einstein, who took from his teacher Minkowski, is actually the person who coined the word space-time. But for Einstein, time was place and measure and discrete and multiple, so that there isn't one event that happens just at that moment. So we can perceive something, the classic, you heard about it when you were in school, I'm sure, but we still casting back when we had television and not cable and not digital. Somewhere out there in the universe, the I Love Lucy show is still playing.
Right. Someone
encounters that for the first time and they're saying, this is new because it's just happening. But of course it happened before.
Right.
So there's the measurable, though quantum nature, relativistic nature of time from the scientific viewpoint of people like Einstein, if there were anyone else like Einstein, Hawking, and so on. And then the other side of that is just the experiential, as we were talking about. So time as not separable into discrete elements. Time as a kind of bubble. So there's time's arrow, and then there's time's bubble. Bubble being something happens, but it is always past, present, and future, constantly going on. So there's a debate about whether you can separate past, present, and future, or all of them are an illusion, but essentially there's only the moment now.
Okay. So yeah, I think that maybe this is something you'll be able to help out with, because I sort of have a hard time wrapping my mind around it. To me, it sort of seems like the people who are from that latter camp, it seems like the first one is scientific, like we've got it down, that's time, we've nailed it. And it seems like the other people like, oh, that's kind of an outdated concept. It's sort of like saying if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, then it didn't make a sound. We all know it did. So, if there's nobody here to experience time, time is still happening, right? But I think that there's a little bit more to that argument than that. Kant and some other people kind of built a system to it. Can you explain a little bit, clarify a little bit why it's still it's still sort of a valid thing to think?
Well, I want to start with a person named Sider, he was born in 1967, and he's one of the current philosophers talking about this. He says the universe is a block. Now this again goes back to the ancient, but reworking it. A manifold. And so all time frames exist within blocks. So language tenses, like I dropped that glass, are reflective of I'm dropping the glass. You always are dropping the glass because it's always there. So the tenses don't necessarily accommodate the fluidity. So time's not a river. I shouldn't have said fluidity, but it's another. I think we mentioned this in a different cast. There's essentially the view that if you had a giant pile of paper and every piece of paper represented a year, billions of pieces of paper, it's all there, and you could open it up and be any one of those particular places because it all happens.
Right, and that kind of comes like you were saying with the I Love Lucy thing. I guess if you, let's say there was aliens living on a planet 30 light years away, if they had a powerful enough telescope, they could look at Earth and see me being born or see you at, however old you were 30 years ago. And so they're looking at it and that's their reality. They're seeing that as this is what's happening. And we do the same thing. We look out everywhere and we see, oh, hey, there's this, that, and the other thing. And we tend to think of it as time or as distance. We think, okay, well, that thing's a far ways away. But in reality, it's not just a far ways away. It's much further back in time. But what we're seeing is a much younger version of it. And that brings up the whole question of, well, if we're seeing it at this point, is it still existing in our present? Or is it something that existed in the past and it no longer...
Omri Bergson takes a very, very different view than Einstein. That's the page he's on. He and Sider and so on would say, well, it's all now. It's not that it was. It's still because this moment is accommodating that because I am remembering, therefore it exists. And if I'm anticipating the future, that's still in this moment. So that's the bubbleness of it. It grows outward.
Yeah, I think that I heard two sort of analogies to explain it. And one was, time is just kind of like a vinyl record, which if you'd mentioned this 10 years ago, nobody knew what it is, but now they do again. So yeah, so our perception is just the needle. So the present is just the needle, but the whole record is there. It just depends on what part is being played at that moment. So as you go around, you hear that specific thing, but the whole record's still there. You're just not in that specific time. Or the other one I heard was, if you're a deep sea diver, you're at the bottom of the ocean, you have a lamp, you have that sphere of light around you, and what's inside of it, is the present. But as you move around, that sphere of light moves with you. And the whole ocean is there, but you only have the perception of what that little bubble that you're in. So I hope that kind of clears up for people the other side of that argument, because I know I was having a hard time with that. It seemed like you think about Einstein, you think about modern science, and that makes so much sense. There's no other side to that argument. But then when you actually start to look at some of these other things, you think, well, that makes sense too.
Yeah. So it's whether you see it as discrete or inseparable. That's really you asked for the two poles, and that's really what they are. Right.
Okay, so let's look at the boundaries of time, and let's start with set points. So, did time start? Will time end? And these are the philosophy questions, like we were talking about a couple episodes ago. The small things or the big things, the bookends. Whenever there's a bookend, starting and an ending point, or a small point and a large point, that's where the philosophy comes in. So who's speculated on the beginning of time and the end of time?
Well, we'll go back to the ancients again. So there's a philosopher named Plotinus. Some people say Plotinus, but I've heard it both ways, Plotinus and Plotinus, who says that there is you'll like this, timeless creator. Here we go with the unmoved mover thing again, except another way of phrasing it, who's immune, an interesting word that we use, to any change, and therefore outside of time. So he's not fundamental, or it's not fundamental to reality. And then there's this chain of being dropping all the way down to humans at the very bottom. So all kinds of supernatural entities or levels of the divine. And so time becomes very important to humans because, as Plotinus says, it's a gift. And Augustine picked up on this metaphysically, to be able to conceive of the infinite, because that way it enhances your attempt, Augustine says much later, at salvation. Plotinus was not talking about that. That was pre-Christian. And so he's saying that it's an illusion for us because we have limited capacity to perceive. So I think Plotinus would probably like the idea of the person at the bottom of the ocean with the light.
Right.
If we had powerful enough light or good enough senses, we probably could see everything. And yes, we've talked about before about if we are narrow in what we take in.
Yeah, I think about that sometimes in little science fiction thought experiments. People ask me about like the Drake equation or, extraterrestrial life and stuff. And it seems like, I think that the answer seems pretty clear where, like, man, we've got pretty good sensing capabilities now and we don't really see much out there. So it's probably, if there's anything, it's microbial or something or whatever. But I think that there is that point where you think about, well, the chances of ever meeting an extraterrestrial species, it would really have to depend on them having an extremely long lifetime. Because, you look at it scientifically and there's a pretty firm consensus that you can't go faster than the speed of light, and that wormholes, although mathematically possible, don't seem to be physically possible because you'd need some sort of anti-gravity to prop them open while you traveled through them and some crazy stuff.
So where we are now, no, but
right.
Where we might be, well, yes.
So yeah, it's theoretically possible, but practically impossible at this point. So, but if you had a species that had a very long lifetime, one of two things would happen. Either you'd have them, they'd be able to live long enough to solve some of these problems, or they would travel the same way that we do at the speed of light, at the cosmic speed limit, the speed of light, but it just wouldn't matter to them that it took millions of years to get to us.
Mm. There's a novel, has a different title. The movie that came out 2 years ago, Arrival. It's one of the best science fiction films that I've seen because it's not primarily about blasting the aliens and all this kind of, it's about language. It's about these creatures who are incredibly old, but they're coming to us for help. But the language that they write exudes through a kind of squid-like oil. Is self-referential, cyclical, and embodies all of time. So it's sort of what Plotinus, and I have to correct myself. I did an egregious thing. So Plotinus was before Christianity. He wasn't. He was 200 years after the birth of Christ. So he was trying to reconcile issues. So editorial, because humbleness is important. But the idea of just picking up on what you said. So here, aliens who their whole perception is of everything that has happened. And so their language accommodates past, present, and future. And this is what frazzles the humans trying to figure out the language. So it's not they land, they speak in English, and then we have a bunch of battles. It's all about wrestling with the tiniest concept. And we're on a linear, and this is what Plotinus was saying, time's arrow. I think a couple of sets ago, we talked about the idea that Christianity was the first major linear religion or metaphysical view. And that's what he was picking up on. So the arrow is this kind of shadowy thing. If you shoot an arrow, I mean, I've done that once in a while. I'm not an archer, but I love archer stories. But and you watch it go. Well, maybe mine doesn't go very far, but you watch it go, and you see it passing through all kinds of moments. Plotinus said, it is that which carries us into the future, and so we watch it. We can conceive of being someplace else, and so time is a divine gift to let us see where we might go.
Right. And this has really important implications for conversations about the self that we'll talk about a couple episodes from now. I was just working on yesterday, but how you perceive yourself moving through time, or is it even yourself, or is it different?
And are you moving?
Right. Yeah. It's all very interesting, but yeah. So, and coming back to that other thing, if you had a species that was real old and that sort of thing, there's somebody who brought up the point that if they were that old, we might not even be able to communicate with them because it might take them so long to form a sentence. Or if you look at an audio spectrum, the longer a wavelength is, the lower it is in pitch, and we might even have a hard time detecting that what they're saying, or so on and so forth, and creates all kinds of different issues.
And Tolkien did this with these Ents. The Ents, the old trees, the tree herders, right? And they, one of that's what the character often says, don't be hasty, right? And so they're taking a day to introduce each other by name. And for the hobbits, this is intolerable because there are things going on. We have to deal with things now. And the trees, no, there's no hurry.
So yeah, then, and I think that a lot of modern philosophers that would speculate on extraterrestrial life would say, yeah, those are issues that we might have. And, so lots of times the arts are imitating the science or the philosophy that's going on. And it's funny that you mentioned Arrival because they have these octopus or squid-like creatures. I was reading a study a couple months ago that was saying that they think that octopus might be extraterrestrial life. They think that octopus might have come on an asteroid or something because they have this ability to repair their DNA and do some things that nothing else on Earth can. And so that's their explanation, which I'm sure that they will debunk quickly. They'll find something else that can do it and it will become a normal.
Speculate though, isn't it? Because of and you said lots of times. See, the way we use that word, and what you said about syllables, this partly Augustine is talking about this. So what happens when we read a poem? We read words that are syllables. The syllables don't exist all at once. One syllable's gone, the next syllable is there. We remember how it goes together, but in discrete moments or units, this syllable, all right, it's gone, it's gone, it's gone. But yeah, we put it together and we remember it, and this is that time rendered in poetry.
So, I mean, yeah, just it's an interesting thing to keep in mind as we have the conversation are we stitching together separate moments in time through human experience, or are they things that exist and do exist on some different plane outside of our experience as part of the universe? Yeah. Okay, so the other part of the boundaries of time, I don't know if we really talked about set points much, the start and the end of time, but
no, we did.
Okay, well, yeah, so who's talked about it? Who has had something to say about it?
Well, again, if you go back, set points as a term, I can't point to philosophers that I can think of offhand that use that term. They're there, but I can do that.
There's probably a reason for that because, there's always been religious traditions that have talked about the beginning of time and the end of time. And so I think that they sort of filled that void in, and philosophers sort of fit into the framework of that. You've had Christian philosophers or Greek philosophers that accepted the religious precedent set. And on top of that, even modern scientists who are looking at the things, it's still religion at that point because a lot of the speculation about the beginning of time or the end of time requires a bit of faith. Some of the science falls apart at those ends anyway.
It does. And the very idea of set points, whatever one calls them. This is what again, Bergson McTaggart wanted to do about. So he says there are different kinds of series. An A series, a series of moments past, present, and future. A B series, a moment that's put in order in relation to other things. So there's the there's a moment, there's a moment, there's a moment. But then there's how do we order those moments and make them important? Well, that requires a beginning and an end of moments, perhaps. But then metaphysicists will say, well, the word beginning is an artificial construct. If the universe is the universe, perhaps it never began. Perhaps it's always been there. But of course, then we have to say, oh, that's when your brain really starts to hurt.
And I'm going to bring that up in our last topic and demonstrate how that works out in an argument. And that'll break some people's brains because it still breaks mine. But yeah, so you read like Stephen Hawking's last work or some of these other people, and they'll say, they'll get questions from these avid science fans, and these science fans they're more philosophy fans, but they just don't know it. But they'll ask, so what happened before the Big Bang? What happened before? And they'll say, and the scientists are very dry folks. So they just say, that question doesn't make any sense. The time started with the beginning of the universe. And in the framework of science, that's true. There is no evidence. There's no reason to believe that there was anything before the Big Bang or the beginning of the universe.
But some people do this. Some people do pick up on the Hawking occasionally did smile and could. No, but then he just presented an infinite regression of mirrors. Well, it began, it ended, it began again.
There's only one that I've heard that doesn't do that. And that is, it's a multiverse theory, but it's not an infinite multiverse theory. And what happens is they say that, if you look at the four major forces, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, gravity, and shoot. But anyways, electromagnetic. So if you go back, what they can do is they can look back and see, you go back far enough, these forces combine, all of them except gravity. Gravity, they cannot get it to combine with the other three. So what they think is, well, if you do some math that doesn't make any sense to me, what you find is that if you trace them back to when those things could have combined, you could have a few dozen or a few hundred universes all created at once. And gravity is the thread that holds them all together. And they all have separate laws for strong nuclear, weak nuclear, and electromagnetic forces. So that one is kind of interesting to me because that does give you, okay, here is a defined set point. Here's a defined number of universes,
which is one of the oxymorons of the title of this whole podcast.
Right, because then people are always going to...
Finite number of universes.
Yeah. Because you ask other scientists, they'll say, well, no, the universe is the sum of everything that we know. So there's nothing outside the universe. So yeah, the whole argument gets kind of nuts. So we'll move on from set points because we didn't talk about it. Then we did talk about it and made a mess of it. So we'll move on. Units of time. So this one was kind of interesting. I was looking up units of time right before you got here. And there was one that there's a unit of time where it's the duration of 9,192,631,770 oscillations of a cesium atom. And that unit of time is a second. 1 second. That's how they measure it. By
almost uncountable number. I mean, it is countable, but oscillations in the...
It raises all kinds of questions for me, like how did you measure that many oscillations in a second? Why that number? All of these things. But
is the number significant?
But it raises, it raises the importance of philosophy and what we've talked about in the previous episodes of the importance of humans of creating categories. Because then you have categories of time based on the sun. There's a year. There's you have categories of time based on the moon. There's a month. You have categories of time based on the earth. There's a day. You go around, the earth rotates, So you have we're drawing on all of these different cosmological phenomenon to categorize something that is, it's just a weird thing.
Well, what you just pointed out with this, that is a wonky, marvelous, brain-busting, discrete moment that you just described, all those oscillations in what we call a second. So there's still that discrete thing that Einstein would be talking about. Augustine says that infinite time gives life purpose. So Augustine, I don't know what he'd say about cesium and oscillations. I'm sure eventually perhaps he'd be able to wrap his head around it were he here with us now. But probably the question would be, but that second has already passed. So no matter how many oscillations, it's not there anymore. Because that's what the past no longer exists. The future is yet to come. And the present continually passes. And so he says, if the present is all that exists, it must be a mathematical point, and yet with no duration. So I think he'd like the oscillations.
Yeah, and that's like I think it was Kant who was talking about. I don't remember what. I honestly don't remember what physical phenomena he was talking about, but all I think about is hula hooping, where you hula hoop and people say that, you're able to keep the hoop going based on your center of gravity. And center of gravity sounds like a unique, distinct point in space, but it's really an imaginary thing. It's not, if you walk 2 steps to the right, well, then it's over here or something. And so the hoop is going around, and it's going around this center of gravity, but, it's what is... Even if you used some sort of scientific thing to establish where's the distinct point in time or in space where a center of gravity.
Yeah, and it's virtually unpinnable. I know this. The scientists would be tearing their hair out hearing me say this. So, but as a layperson, to me, this is where Heisenberg's uncertainty principle comes in yet again, because every time you try to measure something in space, you can't be accurate about it in time. And if you measure it in time, it's moved in space. Mm-hmm. And that your hoop is moving. So even the center of gravity must be in motion because the body is in motion. And therefore, if you watch somebody walk and I have to, this happened yesterday where I stopped to get a lunch. I was going to get my car an airbag changed out. And I stopped at a diner to get a quick takeout. And there were people standing in all kinds of positions. And I just found it fascinating to watch people. I always do. And there was one person who had her legs so crossed that she looked, it just looked an X. And she was moving back and forth. And yes, she was keeping her balance. But then she'd shift, again. And there was a person in front of me who was leaning forward, going back because he was doing something, because we're almost always in motion. Mm. So it's not that the center of gravity is itself an illusion because it's multiple centers depending on the moment.
Yeah. And they find out stuff like this all the time in science where it's what you find answers and then just creates more questions. The most recent one was electrons being football shaped. Because all the science works fine if your electron is spherical. But when you find out it's football shaped, none of it makes sense anymore. Or the same thing with quantum entanglement or anything with any of that stuff. It all becomes kind of...
It becomes the seed bed for marvelous speculation. For me, that's what... It's not the only thing. One of the values of time is that there are all these minds going back in time who are still present because we talk about them and saying essentially the moment is all that there is, not in an economy of scarcity, but in the fullness of the universe. The moment is... Everything exists in the moment because the moment has a duration, but it can't be mathematically pinned because, well, it's gone. This moment's gone. The oscillation happened. Another 9 billion oscillations.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
but not in how we experience it.
Yeah. And I'm still thinking about that. You think of that cesium oscillating almost 10 billion times a second. And that comes back to our are fictional science fiction creatures. You know, if you had something that was a much longer, that cesium, if it was a living thing, that would just be its normal routine. Oh, well, every second I do this 10 billion times. And we'd look like we're moving in slow motion, you know? It would be the same thing. Right. So if something came to visit us that had, you know, a 1,000,000-year lifespan, we'd look like we were moving, you know, and that's where communication issues or all these different things would have a problem, is because we'd all be experiencing time differently. So, you know, that comes back to our original argument. Is everything constructing time in a different way? Or is time the same and everybody's making a different thing out of it?
So back to Kant. You know, Kant talks about what is not and what must be, and then there's that in between place of what can be. So that's when we're talking about ethical philosophy. What's happened is gone. In Kant's view, we can talk about it, we can discuss it, we can agonize about it, and so on. But if there is space, not a deterministic space, a deterministic space would say what must be, because it's all there, it's all in the frame. But what can be, that's where Kant sort of goes to that time, not referencing it necessarily, but the times arrow thing of, okay, so where will that arrow fly? Where can I go with my eyes and my body to follow the path of the arrow? Can I make decisions that will alter the course? Okay.
So yeah, we've covered, you know, units of time a little bit, how we base things, which is kind of an interesting system, because I feel like almost anything else, we will use one sort of thing to measure something. All the time we're measuring the sun, the moon, the earth, or whatever we can do, because it's such a weird kind of unique thing that I think when they first started trying to find units for it, they were using almost anything they could to, now we can do cesium at 10 billion oscillations a second. But before we had that kind of technology, how would you determine what, how would you get people to synchronize their...
Well, we didn't synchronize until we got to the industrial measurement, the clouds. But think about, right now, this year, which is a marvelous word in itself, there are so many different years on this planet, depending on culture, nationality, and which calendar they're going on. We have lots of different calendars on the planet, and we look for a standard. And so we just assume it's our standard. But but they're not. And then we have the, fall back, spring ahead thing with our hours, right? And there are places that choose not to.
I had that happen. My uncle lives in like the Four Corners area, and there's one town that observed daylight savings time and one that didn't. So you drive 15 minutes this way, but, everything is an hour behind where you had just been. So what's changing between the 15 feet over there and the 15 feet over here,
Human determination.
Right.
Which is what Augustine was talking about. And what McTaggart talked about in the 20th century. We choose the reality. It's I think McTaggart was who also said that because of these different series of moments and the ways that we look at them, that there is a clash, an oxymoronic, paradoxical state, and therefore time is a concept that is not even worthy of considering.
Right. So I'm liking this because as we're getting farther along in the conversation, we're starting to pick up arguments for both sides of that time is real versus time is a construct, sort of.
Have you ever in your car when the hour falls back, have you ever just not adjusted your clock?
Not me. I'm real, but Amanda, my wife, she always does it. She will just keep driving until I get in the car, and then I'll change it because it will drive me nuts. But
all right, so I have a similar situation that way, but And my son the other day very kindly changed it for me in the car. I was an hour, but there's an interesting state when you're driving along, paying attention to driving, of course, but still thinking about, I'm in both 9:30 and 10:30.
Right. Or if you're somebody who's chronically late, like my wife, she sets all the clocks, 5, 10, and none of them are the same. So one clock's 5 minutes ahead, one clock's 10 minutes ahead, one goes, and so we're driving somewhere and I'll look at the clock and like, oh my gosh, we're going to be late, and I'm adjusting for the future. I'm looking into the future, seeing how long it will take us to get to some place, looking at the clock and then saying, we're going to be 5 minutes late. And she's like, no, don't worry. This clock is set 5 minutes fast in order to encourage me to live in the future, push my efforts forward in order to be places on time. And the whole thing is just like,
and it's just a matter of consciousness.
Yeah.
Gandalf says, I am never late. A wizard arrives precisely when he should. Okay, so there's that idea of lateness is a construct. We make it so that we can arrive the industrial age. We know this, the old saw about getting the trains to run on time. Okay, so we made ourselves so pressured that if we don't get at the same place, or we get all worked up because we're 15 minutes late, well, that happens if you're 15 minutes late and you miss your flight because of the connections. That causes more anxiety and probably all kinds of medical issues than many other things in this world would. Yeah. And I've experienced it. I think we all have, because we get ourselves worked up. Because why? Because we're going to miss this. Because why? Because we're late. Because why? Because we measure time a certain way, but we can't adhere to it because of the complexity of machinery and the uncertainty of weather. And so the acknowledgement of both the limitations of our own constructs and the not terribly complete predictability of nature itself, we get all twisted.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know for sure I do, because, they have a saying in the Army, if you're 10 minutes early, you're 5 minutes late, because you're supposed to be 15 minutes early for everything. And you show up and then you stand around for an hour before anything happens. But if you're not there exactly on time, something really bad is going to happen to you. And so that passes through to other parts of your life. And I know exactly what you're saying. It does. It creates all kinds of stress over something that is essentially just kind of a human construct that is really pretty.
Yes, you don't picture ancient philosophers saying, we'll have wine in a while. We'll see you when the sun is close to the horizon. Wouldn't that be nice?
It just doesn't make any sense. All right. So let's move on to the part that I think people are going to be the most interested in. That's time manipulation. So let's talk about time travel. Is it possible to travel through time any other way than 1 second into the future?
All right. There are physicists, I can't name them at the moment, I apologize, but I have read them. This is a constant debate at all the science magazines for lay people, like Discover Magazine and Scientific American, has whole issues devoted to it. Those who say, nope, you can't violate this anymore, you can violate the speed of light. It's a fundamental, things happened, they're there, they're gone, we're in the present, the future's coming. That's just how it is. You can't. Because for any number of reasons. Because if you went back in time somehow, then your atoms can't be in two places at the same time. The particular matter of which you're made, so we go back to the pre-Socratics and the matter stuff, it's somewhere else in that time. So you can't have it be in two places at the same time. Well, then there are other physicists, again, speaking as a layperson, who say, yeah, but particles can be in two places at the same time. Some kind of particles can. And only when you notice them does the particle then take up residence in that one.
Yeah, and both of these things are scientifically proven. Hawking radiation is an example of that happening. Right at the event horizon of a black hole, you constantly have particles popping in and out of existence, and they do it as pairs. So at the event horizon of a black hole, if you get right at the edge, you'll have one that pops in inside the black hole and one that pops in outside the black hole. And so as a result, the black hole is very gradually evaporating. It's losing mass because particles that were inside will just pop outside. And so, yeah, they can be in two places at once. They can essentially violate that. Nothing can escape this, not even light. And light is the cosmic speed limit. Well, here's something that it is doing it. Yeah. So,
and then there's the particle called the tachyon, which seems, to make it way too simplistic, to go backwards in time.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's lots of stuff that.
Yeah, as Dr. Who would say, there's stuff.
It's not in the realm of philosophy. It's in the realm of science. There's things that argue for both ways.
But remember, science is philosophy. It is the most ancient, the first of the full.
Because like we said, you can never prove anything. You can just disprove some things. So it's an ever evolving thing. And there is arguments for both camps. Yes, you can time travel, and no, you can't.
So if you did, and this is what I enjoy with good time travel science fiction stories. I love reading what's called hard science fiction. It's not hard as in the sense of, it's going to make you hurt, although it does take extrapolations from current physics and so on. And so I suppose in one sense it's hard, but it just means that it's adhering to the rules and then extrapolating from that. And then there's fantasy kinds of things. But the real question is, why are we so fascinated with time travel? Because we want to change things? Because we want to go back and fix things? We want some kind of wonky, eccentric alien who has a little blue box to go back and forth and repair things as fast as they're falling apart, because then they keep falling apart again. There's this entropic nature in humanity as well as in the universe, and we'll keep stumbling over ourselves and breaking things. And so we want a cosmic janitor to come and fix those up behind us, and then get ahead of us and fix it up there too. It's fascinating. Do we really want to go back and kill our grandfathers? I don't think so, but that's,
right.
Yeah. If I killed my grandfather, then I wouldn't be alive, so I couldn't go back in the first place. That's what'll make your head hurt.
Yeah.
That's why in the Star Trek, Captain Kirk in the novels, time travel gives me a headache. But they form a whole, in the Star Trek universe, they form a whole department of temporal investigation, which is trying to send Kirk to a sort of prison because of the amount of times that he has violated. So now we're going to have the whole legalistic thing about, and Connie Willis is a marvelous science fiction writer who does that kind of thing too. There are rules for time travel. You can't do this, you can't do that, because if you do this, it'll mess that up. Then why are we going to do it in the first place?
Right. Yeah, the whole causality thing is interesting. And it's like you're saying, it says something bigger about humanity, because like you're saying, there's a big trope in the time travel literature is that you go back to fix things, but then you end up making other things worse when you do that. And I think that's really saying something about people. The same thing happens with music. I do music, or with photography. Everybody has a phone in their pocket, and you take a picture and then you put a filter on to fix it. But if you fix it too much, people are going to say that you made it worse than if you just didn't put a thing on.
It doesn't look natural. It looks artificial.
Same thing with auto-tune. You have a bad voice, so you put on auto-tune to make it sound right. But if you use too much auto-tune, people are going to say, well, it sounds auto-tuned. It's a derogatory term, And so I think it's the same thing as, humans have this desire to right wrongs that they did, perceived wrongs, because we can't accept imperfection. But by going back and trying to right these things, we almost reach this uncanny valley where we go, well, this isn't human anymore because it's so perfect.
These are parables of embracing our imperfection.
Yes, yeah, exactly. We want things to have imperfection. We want them to have that level, but we can't accept it.
I think they're also parables of a longing for eternity. And I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but it just occurred to me. If we can, it's like a fictional parable rendering some of the most current notions. The time is a box, a manifold, which carries all time frames within it. Well, it's like we're poking at that idea and beginning science fiction is not about prophecy. So many people love to poke. See, they got that wrong. See how many things H.G. Wells got wrong. Well, that's ridiculous. It's no fun. But as extrapolation or as carrying us forward into more complex ideas, it's a marvelous venue. So I have this feeling with all these shows and so on, we're just saying, oh, maybe the universe is more flexible. Maybe it's fluid. Maybe time is everything past, present, and future. Maybe we are alive in multiple moments at the same time. So it's like a late person rendering of these immense theories.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, this is in our last question. We're gonna get into some of this, but I think that's a good segue into time dilation, which is both the real and perceived changes in duration of time. So we've talked about some of the real changes in duration of time. If you're close to a gravity well like a black hole, time is going to go much slower. If you put a satellite out in space that's telling you how to drive to your grandma's for Thanksgiving, that satellite is going to be traveling and time is going to be at a different rate for it than it is for you, ever so slightly so. So that's a real time dilation, but there's also perceived time dilations that happen on a regular basis where you look at the clock and 5 minutes has gone by. You say, oh man, it feels like it's been an hour. Or an hour goes by and you look at the clock and you think, man, it feels like it's been 5 minutes. What has philosophy had to say about time dilations, real or imagined? What kind of things have been said?
It goes to the idea of the experiential, that we, it's those 2 points that we started out with, that if we take time as experiential, then the mechanistic measurement of it seems, I think we value the experiential more than the mechanistic. I think that the pure ish science values the measure. But I don't think even the humans who are the scientists who are doing that are still saying, well, that's the only thing about time. I think that most of us do like to go to a place, Thanksgiving, whatever it happens to be, and have these marvelous moments, laughter, retelling stories, the family mythic stuff, and realizing that, oh, it's dark. I didn't even, where did it go? Right. I think we value that a lot more. And I think that it also offers some kind of troubling, philosophically, time dilation or time dislocation of the medical idea of Alzheimer's or dementia. The experience, the reality of it for people who are living or reliving moments with their parents, and they are children in their whole identity, in their minds. Where's my mom? Where's my, heart-wrenching things when you experience it. But yet, if you think, all right, there is some dislocation, philosophically, there's some time dislocation going on here. If there's a veil and they've pierced it, then they're time travels. But whatever is happening, there's not a sequence. There's a disruption in what we like. We like sequence, right? Because past, present, and future, that makes us feel comfortable. And so philosophically, I think that's why we favor it. And maybe we don't have the sensibilities, we can't because of our mechanism itself. We see everything in terms of the past and the present. But for those who are dislocated, it's fractured. They're stuck in that place for a while. And then they're in a place that time doesn't exist at all. I'm just here. Why am I here? Who am I? What? Yeah. And I don't think I think that's a magnified medical view. I mean, it's magnified because of the horrors of what families go through and the individual. But I think that can be writ into more normal circumstances with those of us who aren't riddled with Alzheimer's and so on, where sometimes we want to live back in that moment. Sometimes we'll daydream and we'll be where that thing happened. We come back to a moment that makes us smile. You smell a perfume and time travel.
Yeah.
Anosmia, you don't smell a perfume and time travel, but there are probably other things that might. And so it's mental. the British probably say we're being mental right now, but it's just as real.
Yeah. And you look at scientific studies of time dilation, what they find out is you can plot on a graph how you experience time throughout your life, and you see that basically almost a third of your life is spent between 3 and 10 years old because of the time dilation. If you traveling from being 3 years old to 4 years old is an immense amount of time to you as opposed to traveling between 83 and 84 years old, that sort of thing. Or like you were asking about in our first episode, experiencing things, the more things science has shown, the faster something's moving, or the more more activity that's happening, the slower time is experienced. And I think that's part of the reason that I like doing a lot of stuff, is because I have a lot of memories to draw on. I can look back and it seems like I say it all the time to my friends, and I'm 30 years old and it seems like I've been alive forever. It seems like if I were to die tomorrow, I would not be sad, because I can't imagine living 2 or 3 times as long as I already have, because I've already done all of these things. I've already have all the experiences.
Kant would tell you you've been living the good life.
Whereas, there's other people that will be 50 or 60 or 70 years old. Man, where did the time go? It's all gone, so it's really just a strange thing. The time dilation, and I'm sure that if you ask those same people about different things and you had them reliving memories, they would say that the same thing. I have all these experiences. I have all these things. But it's your ability to time travel in your mind that determines whether that span of time seems long or short. What can you pull from it? The memories you have, the experiences you have.
And not to get lost in it. I mean, that's partly what counseling is about, right? Don't get trapped in it at the moment. If not medically or not. Either way, you can get stuck. Or you can say, oh yeah, this was great. That was great. I've done this now. And so on. But it's not like, now I've done this, like some kind of bucket list. It's like, it's just, you're accruing things because you're just moving through the universe doing these things. And then you look at them and say, oh, awesome.
Yeah. And anybody who's ever made plans realizes that that's not the way time works. You make plans and then nothing ever turns out the way you planned it anyway. So, okay. So let's move into our final topic. And the question is, what are the consequences of time being a real dimension versus a perceptual construct? Which is a very poignant way to end, because we've spent the whole episode talking about the one versus the other. So would you like me to go through what I have and then you can comment? Okay. So the first thing I had to say is that if time is just a perception, it changes what mortality means. And what I mean by that is the example I used earlier on, where if you had those aliens that were 30 light years away looking through their telescope at us, if they're seeing me being born, if reality is, just perception, it's just me thinking of time as just something that's created in my mind, then what that means is the light that they are perceiving 30 light years away, that's reality. Einstein liked to think about space-time as a rubber mat. You had different balls that would weigh down different things. But that, it's almost like moving. It's a moving mat. Time as it travels outward, those things are still real, but they're just moving,
And as are you, relativistic.
Right.
So you're 30 and you're 1. You're a second.
Yeah, I'm 1 year old somewhere 29 light years away, somewhere. So if time is just a perception in our head, or if time is real, that changes what it means to be mortal, because in some sense, you're immortal if it's not a perception. If time is a real built into the fabric of the universe sort of thing, you're essentially immortal, but just at points that are outside of your perception, which is a crazy thing to think of. The next thing I had was, if time is just a perceptual construct, its perception may affect our ability to understand the universe, which is again along the same lines. Perception is really kind of the key thing there, because we're looking at the universe at one point in time. And then we're looking out and seeing the universe at 40 million years ago, and only at that point in time. And so there's a great picture if you Google images, like the pillars of the gods, you see these incredible things. And what scientists have said is that those don't exist anymore. A supernova went off and blew all of those clouds of dust and gas away. But we don't see it yet. They just know, they can look at the picture and see this star over here is going to go supernova sometime within 100 million years. And since the pillars of the gods are 500 million light years away, it's already happened, but we just haven't seen it yet. And so, again, perception, it's the same thing that I was saying in the first point, but just outside of my own human experience, it applies to the whole universe. So, do these things currently exist, or did they only exist at one point? And the last thing, and this is the crazy thing, is that at the largest scales, it makes no difference. And so what I mean by that is that if you look at time, really the two sort of scientific consensuses to it are the lesser accepted one is that time is an infinite sort of thing. So the universe will just always exist. It always will exist. And that creates an infinity in the math, where what that means is that if time and therefore, space is infinite, then it encompasses the infinite number of possibilities, meaning that if you and I were to travel in infinite number of light years this way, eventually we would run into you and me conducting this exact same philosophy podcast somewhere else in space. But the other aspect of that is if time is fine, or if the universe is finite, but time is infinite, then there's eventually going to be a quantum fluctuation that will start a new Big Bang, and it will be a cyclical cycle that would go on forever. And eventually the exact same atoms and molecules that make us up would fall into place, and this exact same thing would be happening an infinite number of years later. So it's the same result, but it's just different processes. It's either an infinite amount of time or an infinite amount of space. And that sort of sews together that conception of space-time as one thing. So that's kind of, to me, the consequences of having those two things. The first 2 points talk about if time's a perceptual construct. And that creates some really weird things where we're immortal. Everything that's ever happened in this universe didn't just happen, it is happening. Like you said, we're dropping the glass. The glass is always being dropped. It never, it's always, there's always the present, there's always the past, there's always the future. And that seems to not be right intuitively. But when you look at the other part of it, and you think of time as being a real fundamental part of the universe, then you run into these other issues where it's a different type of mortality. It's almost a record on repeat, or a multiverse. There's going to be several iterations of it in between where we have a podcast on sports or, something like that. So it's going to be something different, So those were the consequences that I could think of.
I'm taking great joy in hearing you articulate this so well, because I mentioned Ted Sider as the not the newest, but he's among the newer philosophers talking about this stuff. And his whole idea of the block manifold universe with all time frames within is called eternalism. So it riffs right off of what you were saying. Right. That's what it's known as a philosophical position. And therefore, every time we find out more about the age of the universe regressing backwards, and we think of ourselves forward into the future in some very strange way, we are as if we are pinning ourselves across time and saying it's all happened. So to me, there's a comfort in that. There's a comfort in the multiverse thing. Whether it is physically so or psychologically, philosophically so. Let's say it's physically so. The number of errors I make in any given day, it would be nice to know that some alternate version of me out there somewhere got it right occasionally. And I'll never know him or see him, but I can project him. I can say, okay, if he can do that, then so can I. But it's not like I'm trying to catch up to myself. It's that, what's the big problem? If we've messed up, there's almost a zen to it. If we've messed up, someone else is going to mess up, or it might not be us this time, or maybe we won't mess up on this, but you can be absolutely certain we're going to mess up on something else. So there's just a comfort in it. It's odd because you take that eternalism and it brings you back to living in the moment. Well, what can I do with this? The idea of the actual physical, the universe is boggling. And I love looking at pictures of space. I have my entire life. And you said that the Pillars of the Gods, always one of the favorites. It exists now in our perception, physically, as you said. We can look at it. There it is. And the science will say, but no, it's not. This is a shadow of it. The event has taken place. Nonetheless, for, standing on the ground kind of realism, that's real enough. And to think about it at one and the same time exists and doesn't exist, that photograph of that nebula teaches us everything that we need to know. Mm. It's there. It's part of the universe. So are we. It's not there, and yet it is there. For us, it's good enough. The correlate to that is out above the hills of Warsaw, looking over toward Batavia. I'm geographically locating this, right? There's a dark place in the sky. And when the Hubble went up and it did its deep sky photograph, in the size of a nickel, if you hold sort of that size up, and put your finger and your thumb together and look, and it's dark, and you look at that same nickel that the Hubble looks at, there are millions of galaxies. We can't see them. The ocean and the bathysphere, the guy walking around with a sphere of light, we can't see them with our unaided eye, but they're there because our machines have told us they're, unless we don't trust our machines, which can lead us to not trusting anything. We need to trust the extension of ourselves enough to say, there's more there we could possibly imagine. When the machines get even better, what other things are we going to see that we had no idea was there? So that too is comforting and exciting.
Yeah. Because, they're talking about, there's the dark matter and the dark energy that make up 96% of the universe. The current thing they're talking about is the dark matter hurricane that's going to hit our galaxy, or, the standard model of physics. There might be a completely, a huge chunk of it that we're missing because we can't yet detect dark matter, molecules and things.
If a star explodes, a certain kind of star, quasar, sends a sheet of gamma radiation. Mm-hmm. We aren't going to know that it's coming.
Yeah.
And it would eradicate us instantly.
Yeah. Just gone.
And so if somebody listening to this, you find comfort in that? Well, I find not comfort in the traditional sense, but I find the joy of the moment again, because we could get tromped on by Godzilla. No, probably not, but we could get wiped out by a quasar.
Or even bigger than that, they've found that the universe isn't a true vacuum. And so matter always wants to be at the lowest state of energy. So they said at any given point, the universe could just turn into a true vacuum state and everything would just incinerate. I mean, we're talking Infinity War.
Right. We're living on the biggest powder keg that could possibly exist. Yeah. Okay. Does that mean I don't want to have a good sandwich for lunch? No.
Exactly. So yeah, I know. I hope that if nothing else, this episode has got people thinking about, not just the moment you're in or the moment that's past or the moments that's to come, but also about if those moments that are outside the one you're currently in are a real thing, or if it's something that you have invented as a human, or what place that plays and how that affects everything. So I think it was a good podcast. Thank you for listening to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. Recording and production are provided by me, Joel Bouchard, and the song featured in the show is Questions off of my album Jaguars, which you can find on Spotify or anywhere MP3s are sold. Until next time, keep popping.